Princess Niran wept tears of pure joy and relief, hugging the battle-hardened human medic Jake so tightly he could barely breathe, after he had just saved her father, the king's life, with his team's futuristic human medical technology. Jake and his 5 fellow Navy SEAL medics, Mike, Steve, Alex, Brian, and David, had been deployed to the war-ravaged planet Zephyria to provide desperately needed medical support to the Evora, blue-skinned humanoid aliens locked in a brutal decade-long civil war with rebel forces led by the vicious warlord Kreshak. Rubble and debris from rebel bombardments littered the once grand royal palace courtyard as Evora soldiers, their cerulean skin charred by plasma burns, were rushed to primitive field hospitals. The 32-year-old human veteran had seen his share of combat as a SEAL, but even he was shocked by the medieval state of Evora medical tech, with rusted surgical tools and scarce antibiotics. His team would need to rely on their own cutting-edge skills and equipment from Earth to have any hope of keeping the Evora king and his army alive against the rebel onslaught. When the stunningly beautiful 25-year-old Princess Niran had greeted Jake's team upon arrival, her regal poise did little to conceal the disdain in her eyes, clearly skeptical that the humans' primitive medicine could be of any use. But now, seeing her father the king breathing steadily after an hours-long surgery by Jake and his men to remove shrapnel from a rebel bombardment, Princess Niran finally realized the true selfless heroism and advanced abilities of the human warriors. She shuddered to imagine how many more of her people would have died without them. Jake and his fellow medics would need to perform near miracles with their futuristic medical technology to keep the Evora from being slaughtered by the rebel forces. The survival of the king and the entire planet rested on their shoulders. Jake and his fellow Navy SEAL medics had no time to rest on their laurels after saving the Evora king. Scores of injured Evora soldiers poured into the makeshift field hospital, their cobalt blood staining the once pristine marble floors of the royal palace. The human medics sprang into action, triaging the most critically wounded and rushing them to the operating tables. Suddenly a massive explosion shook the palace to its very foundations. Huge chunks of the ceiling came crashing down, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Rebel artillery shells had breached the outer walls and were now raining down on the palace itself. The distinctive whine of Kreshak's plasma cannons could be heard over the screams of the wounded. "Shit, they've broken through the defenses!" Mike yelled as he dragged an injured Evora soldier under a sturdy-looking table. Evora warriors rushed to take up defensive positions, their energy rifles crackling as they returned fire. In the chaos and confusion of the rebel assault, Jake suddenly spotted Princess Niran lying motionless on the floor of the medical wing, a pool of azure blood spreading out from a jagged shard of shrapnel jutting from her stomach. "Fuck, the princess is hit," Jake shouted to his team as he sprinted to Niran's side, dodging falling masonry and energy bolts as he went. He skidded to his knees beside her prone form, immediately assessing her injuries with a practiced eye. The fragment had punctured her abdominal cavity. She was bleeding out fast. She needed surgery right now, or she would die for sure. "Steve, Mike, get over here," Jake called out as he hooked his arms under Niran's shoulders and dragged her to an overturned table. "I need you to assist. The rest of you, cover that fucking door." As Alex, David, and Brian took up positions at the entrance to the medical wing, energy rifles in hand, Jake and his 2 fellow medics worked feverishly to stabilize Niran. They had almost nothing to work with besides the equipment they had brought with them. The floor was their operating table, Jake's headlamp the only illumination. Drawing on his intensive training in Evora anatomy and physiology, Jake carefully cut away the princess's blood-soaked robes to expose the wound. Taking a deep breath to steady his hands, he grasped the shrapnel and extracted it in one swift motion. Niran's blood welled up, azure and viscous. "Get me the clamps and sutures," Jake ordered as he explored the wound cavity with his fingers. The fragment had lacerated her intestines and perforated her stomach. This was going to be a long and difficult surgery. For hours, as the battle raged around them, and his teammates fought off dozens of rebel assaults, Jake painstakingly stitched and repaired the grievous damage to Niran's organs. Her alien anatomy presented unique challenges, but Jake's months of pre-mission training and prep had given him an intricate understanding of Evora physiology that was proving invaluable now. As he made the final sutures and checked Niran's vitals for the 100th time, Jake suddenly realized he could no longer hear the sounds of combat echoing through the palace. The Evora royal army must have finally beaten back the rebel forces. Slumping back against the wall, his surgical gloves sticky with blue gore, Jake watched the steady rise and fall of Niran's chest and the strong, even beeping of the vitals monitor. He had done it. Despite everything, he had saved her. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. This planet, and this stunningly beautiful alien princess, would need him and his medics more than ever in the days to come. As Niran slowly regained consciousness in the makeshift medical bay, news of Jake's incredible surgical feat spread like wildfire through the battered palace. Evora soldiers and civilians alike spoke in reverent whispers of the human medic who had saved their beloved princess from the brink of death. General Zakari himself strode into the medical wing, his battle-scarred face etched with gratitude, as he clasped Jake's blood-stained hands in his own. "Dr. Jake, words cannot express the depth of our gratitude for what you have done. You saved not just our princess, but the hope of our people. I would be honored if you would accept the position of Chief Medical Officer here at the palace." Jake, exhausted but resolute, met the general's gaze with a weary smile. "I'm honored by your offer, General, but my place is out there on the front lines where I can do the most good. My team and I didn't come here to sit behind palace walls. We came to help your people, and that's what we intend to do." Before General Zakari could respond, a frantic Evora soldier burst into the room. "General, urgent news from the front. Kreshak's forces have begun attacking civilian villages, sir. They're slaughtering innocents by the dozens." Jake was on his feet in an instant, fatigue forgotten. "General, send us to where we're needed most. We'll do everything in our power to help." Within the hour, Jake and his team were in a dropship speeding towards Never, a small farming village that had been one of the hardest hit by Kreshak's guerrilla strikes. As they touched down amidst the smoldering ruins and wails of the wounded, the scale of the devastation became appallingly clear. Dozens of Evora civilians lay broken and bleeding among the rubble, azure blood pooling beneath crushed limbs and perforated bodies. Jake's team wasted no time, setting up a triage center in what had once been the village square and beginning to treat the most grievously injured. As Jake triaged patients, his eyes fell on a small crumpled form half buried in the debris. It was a young Evora boy, his legs crushed and mangled by fallen masonry. Jake knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. The boy's breaths came in shallow, rapid gasps. He would die without immediate medical intervention. "I've got a critical here," Jake shouted over the chaos. "Prep for surgery now." The next several hours passed in a frantic blur as Jake and his team fought to save the lives of Nevar's wounded. The human medics worked miracles with their advanced technology, stabilizing patients that the Evora had already given up for dead. But it was the young boy, whose name Jake learned was Taran, who consumed his every waking moment. Jake labored over Taran's ruined legs for hours, painstakingly reconstructing shattered bones and torn blood vessels. He used every technique in his arsenal, pushing himself and his equipment to their limits. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the smoke-filled air, Jake finally stepped back from Taran's still form, his armor streaked with blood and sweat. The boy's vital signs were stable, and his legs, though still grievously injured, showed promise of recovery. Jake allowed himself a brief moment of relief as he watched the steady rise and fall of Taran's chest. He had done it. Against all odds, he had given this boy a chance at life. But even as he savored this small victory, Jake knew that their battle was far from over. Kreshak's forces would strike again, and more innocent lives would hang in the balance. As he looked out over the sea of wounded Evora, Jake didn't let himself think about the challenges ahead. For now he simply focused on the life in front of him, the one he had saved, and he prepared himself to do it all over again. As the sun rose over the shattered remains of Never, Jake emerged from the makeshift triage center. his armor streaked with blood and grime. The human medic had worked tirelessly through the night, saving dozens of Evora lives with his advanced skills and technology. News of Jake's heroic actions spread like wildfire through the besieged planet. In every city and village, Evora spoke in reverent whispers of the human warrior who had snatched life from the jaws of death. Jake became a symbol of hope for a people on the brink of annihilation. Princess Niran, now fully recovered from her own brush with death, made the journey to Neva to thank Jake personally. As she stepped from her transport, her eyes widened at the destruction that surrounded her. But amidst the rubble and ruin, she saw something else, the grateful faces of her people alive because of Jake and his team. Niran found Jake kneeling beside a cot, checking the vitals of a young Evora boy. With a start, she recognized the child's face. It was Tarin, her own younger brother, his legs wrapped in high-tech human dressings. "You saved him," Niran whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had lost him forever, but you gave him back to me." Jake looked up, surprised to see the princess. He rose to his feet, suddenly self-conscious of his haggard appearance. "Your Highness, I was just doing my duty," he said. "No," Niran said, stepping forward and grasping his hands. "What you did was more than duty. You have shown me the true strength and compassion of humanity. You have given me hope when I had none." As they spoke, Jake saw in Niran a kindred spirit, someone who understood the heavy burden of responsibility, the driving need to protect one's people at all costs. In that moment, a bond was forged between them, a connection that transcended the barriers of species and culture. But their newfound understanding was shattered by a sudden commotion at the edge of the village. A transport ship landed heavily, disgorging a group of Evora soldiers. They approached rapidly, their faces grim. "Your Highness," the lead soldier called out. "Urgent news from the capital. Kreshak has unleashed a new weapon, a virus that targets Evora physiology. Thousands are already dead, and more fall ill every hour." Niran reeled back, her hand going to her mouth in horror. Jake steadied her, his mind already racing. "We need to get back to the palace," he said. "My team and I have experience with biological agents. We'll do everything in our power to find a cure." Over the next several days, Jake and his fellow medics worked around the clock, analyzing samples of the virus and studying its effects on Evora biology. But even with their advanced knowledge, they could make little headway against the insidious pathogen. It was Niran who provided the breakthrough they needed. Scouring ancient texts in the palace library, she discovered stories of a reclusive Evora subspecies, the Zephyrians, who were said to possess immunity to all disease. "The Zephyrians live high in the mountains, shunning contact with the outside world," Niran explained to Jake. "But if the old tales are true, their blood could hold the key to curing this plague." There was no time to waste. Jake, Niran, and a hand-picked squad of Evora commandos boarded a stealth transport and set off for the Zephyrian highlands, a journey fraught with peril. Kreshak's forces, sensing the importance of their mission, dogged their every step, forcing them into skirmish after skirmish. The terrain grew more treacherous as they ascended, razor-sharp crags and yawning chasms replacing the war-blasted plains below. The thin air sapped their strength, and the cold bit through even their high-tech thermal gear. But Jake pushed on, driven by grim determination. He would not let Niran's people perish, not while he still drew breath. Beside him, Niran matched his resolve step for step, her own desire to save her world burning bright. Finally, after a grueling climb, they reached the Zephyrian enclave, a collection of ancient stone dwellings perched precariously on a windswept cliff. The villagers, clad in simple robes, regarded the outsiders with wary eyes. Niran stepped forward, hands outstretched in supplication. In the lilting Zephyrian dialect, she pleaded their case, begging the elders for the gift of their blood. For a long moment, the Zephyrians conferred amongst themselves, their voices rising and falling like the mountain wind. Then, the eldest of them stepped forward. "The princess speaks the truth," he said in heavily accented Evora. "The sickness that ravages the lowlands is a great evil. We will give you what you seek." Jake nearly collapsed with relief. As the Zephyrians prepared to draw their blood, he met Niran's gaze, a look of triumph passing between them. They had done it. Against all odds, they had found a way to save her people. But even as they prepared to depart, the distinctive whine of Kreshak's attack ships filled the air. The rebel warlord had tracked them to the very roof of the world, intent on stopping them before they could deliver the cure. "Go!" Jake yelled to Niran over the rising wind. "Get the blood samples to the transport. I'll hold them off." Jake leaped from the dropship, energy rifle in hand, Niran close behind him clutching the precious case of Zephyrian blood. The whine of Kreshak's attack ships grew louder as they streaked toward the exposed landing pad. "Go, go, go," Jake shouted, laying down covering fire as Niran sprinted for the palace doors. Plasma bolts sizzled past, scorching the stone around them. Inside the palace, controlled chaos reigned as Evora doctors and scientists scrambled to mass-produce the cure. Jake and Niran burst into the main laboratory, startling the assembled researchers. "We have it," Niran declared, slamming the case down on the central table. "The key to our salvation." Over the next several hours, as the battle raged outside, the cure was synthesized and loaded into distribution pods. Jake coordinated with Evora military leaders to organize a planet-wide inoculation effort, prioritizing the most heavily infected areas. Slowly, surely, the tide began to turn. Reports flooded in of the sick rising from their beds, the fever breaking, the virus loosening its deadly grip. Across Zephyria, Evora wept with relief and joy. But there was little time to celebrate. Kreshak, seeing his biological weapon thwarted, threw everything he had at the capital in a desperate bid to seize power before the Evora regained their strength. The palace shook with the impact of artillery shells and the screech of energy weapons. Jake and his team took up positions alongside the Evora Royal Guard, pouring fire into the advancing rebel lines. "Hold the line!" Jake roared over the din of battle. "For Zephyria, for the Evora!" The human weapons cut swathes through the rebel ranks, their advanced targeting systems and armor-piercing rounds making short work of Kreshak's troops. But the rebels kept coming, heedless of their losses, driven by their leader's fanatical will. At the height of the fighting, a rebel breaching pod smashed through the palace walls, disgorging a squad of Kreshak's elite warriors, with the warlord himself at their head. Jake locked eyes with Kreshak across the rubble-strewn courtyard. In that moment, he saw only hatred, only the burning desire to destroy all that the Evora had built. With a wordless battle cry, Jake charged, firing from the hip. Kreshak met him head-on, energy blade flashing. They clashed in the center of the maelstrom, human and Evora, locked in a deadly embrace. Kreshak was fast, far faster than any opponent Jake had faced before. His blade seemed to be everywhere at once, a humming blur of purple energy. Jake parried frantically, his rifle smoking in his hands. But for every blow Jake blocked, another found its mark. First blood was his, a glancing slice across the ribs, then another, a stab to the thigh. Jake gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to yield. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jake battered aside Kreshak's blade and rammed the muzzle of his rifle under the warlord's chin. Kreshak's eyes widened in sudden fear. "For the Evora," Jake snarled and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked in his hands, and Kreshak's head snapped back, a smoking hole where his face had been. The warlord crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror ended at last. But even as the rebel forces broke and ran, Jake felt his own strength fading. He looked down to see his armor slick with blood, perforated by a dozen wounds. He collapsed to his knees, the rifle slipping from his nerveless fingers. Through darkening vision he saw Niran running towards him, her face a mask of anguish. "Jake!" she cried, skidding to a halt beside him and gathering him into her arms. "Hold on, please, hold on." Jake tried to speak, but only a bloody froth emerged. He could feel his life ebbing away, draining into the shattered stones of the courtyard. But as he gazed up into Niran's tear-filled eyes, he felt no fear, only peace. He had done what he came to do. The Evora would live. Niran would live. With a final effort, he reached up to touch her cheek, leaving a smear of crimson on her cerulean skin. "It was an honor to serve," he whispered. And with those words, Jake Robertson, hero of the Evora, slipped away into eternity, his mission complete at last. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.